Working the night shift at the mortuary in Edinburgh has become second nature to me. The silence, once eerie, now feels like an old friend, comforting in its predictability. I've seen just about everything bodies in every condition you can imagine, and after years in this line of work, you start to develop a kind of numbness. It's not that you don't care, but you learn to detach yourself. That's how you get through the long, cold nights. The walls of the mortuary with their sterile white tiles are more familiar to me than my own home. I've come to rely on the routine, the certainty of it all. But there are some nights that remind you why this job is not for the faint of heart. It was a quiet night, just like any other, when they brought in a body that would shake me to my core. The man was middle-aged, his face etched with lines that spoke of a hard life, but it wasn't his appearance that unsettled me. It was the burns. They covered his body in strange, irregular patterns, like flames had licked at his skin, but never fully consumed him. I've seen burn victims before, but this was different, almost like the fire had a mind of its own. The sight of those burns sent a shiver down my spine, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that it was just another body, just another night. But that sense of unease wouldn't let go. As I prepared for the autopsy, laying out my instruments and donning my gloves, I couldn't help but feel like something was wrong, terribly wrong. I'd handled countless bodies, performed autopsies with the precision of a machine, but tonight my hands felt clumsy, my movements uncertain. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating, and I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, as if expecting someone or something to be there. It was irrational, of course. There was no one else in the mortuary, just me and the dead. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I tried to focus on the task at hand, forcing myself to think logically. The burns could be explained. Perhaps he was caught in a fire, or maybe it was something chemical. But the patterns, the way they twisted and turned across his skin, made no sense. They seemed almost deliberate, as if someone or something had carefully placed them there. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a cold sweat forming on my brow. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. I was supposed to be in control, the professional who had seen it all. But tonight, that control was slipping through my fingers. The room, once familiar and safe, now felt like a trap. The silence that I had once found comforting was now oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the fluorescent lights, set my nerves on edge. I kept telling myself to get a grip, to just get on with it, but my body wasn't listening. I hesitated, the scalpel poised above the body's chest, my mind screaming at me to stop, to walk away. But that wasn't an option. I had a job to do. So I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and made the first incision. That's when everything changed. The moment the scalpel touched his skin, I knew something was wrong. The air in the room grew colder, the lights dimmed, and a strange metallic taste filled my mouth. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't stop now. I had to see it through, had to understand what was happening. But the deeper I cut, the worse it got. The burn marks seemed to pulse under the blade, almost as if they were alive. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I wanted to run, to get out of that room, but I was frozen, trapped by my own fear. As I stood there, staring down at the body, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't the first time I'd felt that way tonight, but now it was stronger, more insistent. I could feel eyes on me, cold and unblinking, but I was too afraid to look up. The room was deathly silent, the only sound the rapid beating of my heart. I knew I had to keep going, but every instinct was telling me to stop, to get out of there while I still could. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Something was about to happen, something terrible, and I was powerless to stop it. The moment I made the incision, the room changed. It wasn't just the temperature that dropped, it was like the entire atmosphere shifted, thickening with an unseen force. I've heard about this kind of thing before, stories passed around by those who work in places like this. But I never believed them. I always thought they were just tall tales, meant to spook the new guys. But as I stood there, scalpel in hand, I felt every hair on my body stand on end. It was like the air itself had turned against me, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. And then I heard it, a whisper, soft and distant, like it was coming from the depths of a well. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I mean, who wouldn't? You're alone in a room with a corpse. Your mind starts playing tricks on you. But the whisper didn't stop. It was faint, almost like a breeze passing through the room, but there was no mistaking it. It was coming from the body. My hands started to tremble as I leaned in closer, trying to make out the words, but they were too garbled, too distorted to understand. It was like listening to a radio station just out of range, the words slipping away the moment you tried to grasp them. But there was something in the tone that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't a plea or a cry for help. It was something darker, something that made my blood run cold. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the wind, maybe a draft coming through one of the old windows. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The room was sealed tight, not a single breeze to be felt. I was sweating now, despite the cold, my pulse hammering in my ears. Every instinct was screaming at me to stop, to leave the room, to get out before it was too late. But I was frozen, caught between my duty and my fear. I forced myself to continue, each movement of the scalpel feeling heavier than the last. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like they were trying to tell me something, but all I could hear was that eerie, inhuman tone. And then it happened. The body twitched. Just a small movement, barely noticeable, but enough to send a jolt of pure terror through me. I froze, the scalpel slipping from my fingers and clattering to the floor. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the body, waiting for it to move again. But it didn't. It just lay there, as still as the grave, those burn marks staring back at me like a mocking grin. I wanted to believe it was just a muscle spasm, a natural reflex, but something inside me knew better. This wasn't natural. This wasn't supposed to happen. I tried to pull myself together, telling myself to be rational, to think like a professional. But how do you stay rational when the dead start moving? I reached down to pick up the scalpel, my hand shaking so badly I could barely grip it. As I straightened up, something caught my eye, a flicker, a brief flash of movement. I looked up just in time to see the corpse's eyes flutter open, just for a second, before closing again. My heart stopped, my body going cold all over. I've seen a lot of things in my time, but I've never seen that. Never. Panic surged through me, and before I knew what I was doing, I was backing away, my mind screaming at me to get out, to run. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the body. It was like it was daring me to stay, daring me to continue the autopsy. The whispers were still there, growing louder now, almost urgent, but I couldn't understand a word they were saying. All I knew was that I needed to get out of that room. I needed help. I needed someone to tell me that I wasn't losing my mind, that what I'd just seen was impossible. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. I turned and fled, my footsteps echoing in the silent corridor as I ran for the phone. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing fit. The eyes, the whispers, the twitching hand, it was all too much. I reached the phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. As I waited for someone to pick up, I couldn't help but glance back down the hallway, half expecting to see that burned corpse standing there, watching me. But the hall was empty, as silent and still as the grave. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that those whispers were still echoing in my ears, warning me of what was to come.
I remember that night as if it were yesterday, though part of me wishes I could forget. My name is Laura Baker, and I've been working as an autopsy assistant at a small old morgue in New Orleans for several years. It's not the kind of job most people would want, but I've always been fascinated by the human body and the stories it tells, even in death. The morgue where I work is tucked away in a forgotten part of the city, the kind of place where the past and present seem to blend together. The building itself is ancient, with floors that creak underfoot and lights that flicker more often than they should. It's always been a little eerie, but nothing ever truly frightened me until that night. It was an oppressively hot summer evening, the kind that makes the air feel thick and suffocating. The morgue was unusually quiet, which I found a bit unsettling. There were no police sirens in the distance, no voices echoing down the empty hallways. Just silence. Then, the doors swung open, and the paramedics wheeled in a body on a gurney. I could tell right away that this wasn't going to be a routine autopsy. The man was middle-aged, and his face was twisted in an expression of sheer terror, as if he'd seen something so horrifying that it had literally scared him to death. The paramedics mentioned a car accident, but something about the whole situation felt off, like there was more to the story. As I prepped the body for the autopsy, a strange sensation began to creep over me. It was like the room had suddenly grown darker, even though the lights were still on. The air, which had been stiflingly hot just moments before, turned cold, so cold that I could see my breath in front of me. I've dealt with plenty of corpses in my time, but this one felt different. There was an energy around it, something almost palpable that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I couldn't stop staring at the man's face, at those wide, terrified eyes that seemed to be pleading for help. But help with what? He was already dead. I thought about the accident, wondering what could have caused such an expression. It wasn't just fear, it was pure, unadulterated horror. Whatever this man had seen in his final moments, it had left a mark, not just on his face, but on the entire room. I began to feel a tightness in my chest, a sense of dread that I couldn't explain. It was as if the air itself had become heavy, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the lights began to flicker. The flickering lights weren't unusual in that old morgue, but this time it felt different, like they were reacting to something. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone or something standing in the shadows, but there was nothing, just me and the corpse. I could feel my heartbeat quickening, a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my hands were shaking, and the cold was becoming unbearable. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the temperature had dropped at least 30 degrees in a matter of minutes. My breath was coming out in visible puffs, and my fingers were starting to go numb. And then, out of nowhere, I felt it, a presence. It was like someone was standing right behind me, close enough that I should have been able to feel their breath on my neck. I wanted to turn around, to see who or what was there, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Was it the spirit of the man whose body lay on the table? Had he brought something back with him from wherever he'd been? Finally, I forced myself to turn, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. And that's when I saw it. The corpse was no longer lying flat on the table. It was sitting upright, its cold, lifeless eyes fixed directly on me, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was no way this could be real. Corpses don't just sit up on their own. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but there wasn't one. The man's eyes, those cold, lifeless eyes, seemed to follow me as I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the walls, making everything feel even more surreal. I was terrified, but at the same time, I felt compelled to move closer, to see if this was some kind of horrible trick. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. As I stood there, paralyzed by fear, the temperature in the room dropped even further. It felt like I had stepped into a freezer, and the chill was bone deep. My breath came out in white puffs, and my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that morgue as possible, but something kept me rooted to the spot. It was as if the corpse was holding me there, demanding my attention. I could feel its presence growing stronger, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. It was suffocating, like the air itself was thickening around me. The lights continued to flicker, casting the room in and out of darkness. Every time they went out, I feared that when they came back on, something even worse would be standing in front of me. My imagination ran wild with horrifying possibilities. Was the corpse going to move again? Was it going to speak? I tried to shake off the thoughts, but they clung to me like a cold sweat. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like I was caught in some kind of nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. But this was no dream, this was happening, right in front of me. I finally mustered the courage to take a step forward, my legs feeling like lead. I reached out a trembling hand, half expecting the corpse to reach out and grab me. But as I got closer, I noticed something that sent a new wave of terror through me. The man's mouth, it was slightly open, and from within, I could hear the faintest sound. It was a whisper, soft and barely audible, but unmistakable. It was as if he was trying to tell me something that I didn't want to hear. The words were garbled, but the tone was clear. He was warning me. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but I knew no one would hear me. The morgue was isolated, and I was alone with this thing that shouldn't be moving, shouldn't be speaking. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. There was no escape. Whatever was happening here, I was trapped in the middle of it. The flickering lights, the freezing cold, the eerie whispers, it all felt like a scene from a horror movie. But it was my reality, and I had no idea how to make it stop. I took another step back, my eyes never leaving the corpse. It was still sitting up, still staring at me with those dead eyes. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but I couldn't make out the words. They were just sounds, haunting and chilling, echoing in the cold, dark room. I knew I had to do something, but what? I couldn't leave the morgue. I was the only one on duty, and this was my responsibility. But every instinct was screaming at me to get out, to run and never look back. I was caught in a terrifying limbo, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in, the air growing thicker and colder by the second. I felt like I was suffocating, like something was squeezing the life out of me. I needed to move, to get out of that room before it was too late. But as I turned to make my escape, I realized with a sinking feeling that the door was farther away than I remembered. It was as if the morgue itself was playing tricks on me, warping reality to keep me trapped in that nightmare. And deep down, I knew that whatever was happening, it was only going to get worse. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out, but I couldn't move. The room was unbearably cold now, like a tomb, and the lights were flickering faster, casting frantic, distorted shadows across the walls. The corpse still sat upright on the table, its lifeless eyes locked on me, and I could feel its presence growing stronger, more menacing. It was as if it was drawing me in, pulling me closer, even though every fiber of my being wanted to run. But I was frozen, trapped in the grip of terror. I tried to steady my breath, to think clearly, but the panic was overwhelming. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence that seemed to press down on me from all sides. I could feel the weight of the corpse's stare, as if it was reaching into my soul, searching for something. My legs were trembling, but they wouldn't move. It was like I was glued to the spot, unable to escape the nightmare unfolding before me. The air around me grew thicker, suffocating, as if the room itself was closing in, sealing me in with this impossible, terrifying thing. Finally, I forced myself to move, to back away from the table. But as I did, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a soft, rustling noise, like fabric shifting. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head, terrified of what I might see. The corpse hadn't moved, but there was something different, something wrong. The sheet that had been covering its body was now draped across its lap, as if it had been pulled down by unseen hands. My pulse raced, and I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead despite the freezing cold. I took another step back, my eyes never leaving the corpse. And then, as if in slow motion, I saw it happen. The corpse's head tilted ever so slightly to the side, as if acknowledging me. My stomach dropped, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This couldn't be real. Corpses don't move. They don't react. But this one was, and it was looking right at me, as if it was alive or something close to it. The reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. But I couldn't afford to lose consciousness, not here, not now. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to put distance between myself and the corpse. But as I reached the door, a new terror gripped me. The door wouldn't budge. I yanked on the handle, desperate to escape, but it was as if the door was sealed shut. Panic surged through me, and I pounded on the door with both fists, screaming for help that I knew wouldn't come. The room was closing in. The cold was unbearable, and the corpse's presence was suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. I was trapped, and I knew I wouldn't be able to hold out much longer. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, I turned back to the room, hoping against hope that something had changed, that maybe the corpse was gone. But it wasn't. It was still there, still watching me. But now there was something new. Its mouth had opened wider, and I could see a faint wisp of something, like smoke, escaping from between its lips. The lights flickered one last time, and then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I felt a cold, icy hand brush against the back of my neck, and that was the last thing I remembered before everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold, hard floor of the morgue, my body aching from the impact. The lights were back on, and everything looked normal except for one thing. The corpse was lying flat on the table again, exactly where it had been when I started. There was no sign of movement, no trace of the terror that had unfolded just moments before. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. The memory of that night would never leave me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened wasn't over. The corpse might have been still now, but I knew, deep down, that it wasn't at rest. And neither was I.
I never thought I'd be haunted by the dead, but then again, life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. My name is Miguel Ortega, and I've been a pathologist in Mexico City for what feels like a lifetime. I've seen countless bodies come and go, each one with its own story etched into flesh, but nothing could have prepared me for what arrived that night. The morgue was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, like the calm before a storm. The clock had just struck midnight when the body was wheeled and found in an alley. No ID, no history, just a cold, lifeless shell. There was something different about this one, though, something that sent a chill down my spine the moment I laid eyes on it. The tattoos were the first thing that stood out. They weren't the usual crude prison ink or gang symbols that I was used to seeing. No, these were intricate, almost beautiful in their design, but there was something off about them. The lines were too sharp, too precise, and they seemed to shimmer in the dim light of the morgue, as if they had a life of their own. I leaned in closer, squinting at the symbols, trying to make sense of them, but they were in a language I couldn't recognize, nothing like I'd ever seen before. As I prepared for the autopsy, that uneasy feeling only grew stronger. The room, already cold, seemed to drop a few more degrees, and I could see my breath hanging in the air. It wasn't the first time I'd felt uneasy in this job, but this was different. This was primal, the kind of fear that gnaws at you from the inside, telling you to run even when there's nowhere to go. But I'm not one to be scared off easily. After all, the dead are just that dead. They can't hurt you, right? At least, that's what I kept telling myself as I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. The first incision was always the hardest, but this time, my hands were steady, or at least I thought they were. I cut through the skin, expecting the usual blood, muscle, bone, but what I found was far from ordinary. The tattoos seemed to react to the scalpel, the lines pulsing under the blade as if they were alive. I paused, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Was it a trick of the light? Fatigue, maybe? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of doubt that was creeping in. I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to let a little unease stop me. But the deeper I went, the more unsettling it became. The symbols seemed to change, to shift as if they were trying to communicate something dark and ancient that I couldn't even begin to understand. I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind, focusing instead on the task at hand, but it was no use. The room felt smaller, the shadows closing in around me, and for the first time in years, I felt truly afraid. What was I dealing with here? What had I let into my morgue, into my mind? Just as I was beginning to think I was losing it, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then they went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, listening to the deafening silence. And then, from somewhere deep within the shadows, I heard it, the sound that would haunt me for the rest of my days. A low, guttural laugh, echoing through the room, bouncing off the walls, mocking me, daring me to continue. I was no longer in control. Something else had taken over, something that had been waiting, lurking in the dark, and now it was free. The darkness was suffocating, wrapping around me like a shroud, and for a moment, I was paralyzed by the sheer weight of it. My hands fumbled in the pitch black, searching for the flashlight I always kept nearby, but it was as if the very air had turned against me, thick and unyielding. The laughter, it was still there, growing louder, more menacing, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt, reverberating through my bones. I could hardly believe what was happening, and yet, deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The tattoos, the ones that had seemed so still, so harmless, were coming to life. When the lights flickered back on, I wasn't in the same room anymore. Or at least, it didn't feel like it. The morgue I knew so well had transformed into something alien, unfamiliar, the walls distorted, the shadows darker than they should have been. And there, on the table, the body lay as it had before, but the tattoos, oh God, the tattoos were moving. Slowly at first, like the crawling of insects under the skin, but then faster, more frantically, as if they were trying to escape. I watched in horror as the symbols twisted and coiled, forming patterns that were as mesmerizing as they were terrifying. Instinctively, I reached for the scalpel again, thinking maybe I could cut the source of whatever this was, stop it before it got any worse. But the moment the blade touched the skin, it was like the air around me erupted in static, and the force of it knocked the scalpel from my hand. I stumbled back, clutching the edge of the table for support, but the ground beneath me seemed to shift, like I was standing on the deck of a ship in a storm. The laughter, that awful, mocking laughter, swelled in volume, and I realized with a sinking dread that it was coming from the corpse itself. I had to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't move, my body frozen in place by some unseen force. The tattoos were glowing now, a sickly green light that cast grotesque shadows on the walls. I could feel the heat radiating off them, burning through the air, and with it came a smell like sulfur, like something rotting from the inside out. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but there was no sense to be found. This wasn't a nightmare I could wake up from. This was real, and it was happening right in front of me. The shadows in the room began to shift, gathering at the corners, creeping towards me as the light from the tattoos grew stronger. I could see them out of the corner of my eye, twisted, misshapen figures that seemed to stretch and distort as they moved closer. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I had to do something, anything to break the spell, to stop whatever was happening before it consumed me completely. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't look away from the body, from those damned tattoos that were now pulsing in time with the beating of my own heart. I wasn't alone in that room anymore. Something else was there with me, something ancient and evil, something that had been unleashed the moment I'd laid that scalpel on the skin. And it was angry. The air crackled with energy, and the walls seemed to close in, as if the room itself was alive, breathing, watching. I could feel its eyes on me, could hear its voice in my head, whispering words I couldn't understand, but instinctively knew were a curse, a warning of the horrors yet to come. I was trapped, caught in the web of whatever malevolent force had taken over, and there was no escape. The last thing I remember before everything went black again was the sensation of the tattoos, the way they seemed to reach out, almost touching me, almost pulling me in. And the laughter, it was the laughter that haunted me, that would continue to haunt me for the rest of my life. Because deep down, I knew that whatever this was, it wasn't finished with me. Not yet. The darkness came rushing back, a void so complete, it swallowed every bit of light and sound, leaving me in a terrifying silence. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum, but I could barely breathe, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. I reached out blindly, desperate to find something, anything to anchor myself, but my fingers met nothing but cold, empty space. The laughter had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse, as if the very walls of the morgue were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I took a step forward, my legs shaky, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Where was I? The room seemed different now, twisted like a funhouse mirror version of the place I knew so well. The walls were too close, the shadows too deep, and the bodyguard, where was the body? It had vanished, leaving the table empty, the sheets crumpled as if something had crawled out from under them. Panic surged through me, cold and paralyzing, and I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall with a thud that reverberated through the silence. It was then that I noticed the tattoos. Not on the body, no. The body was gone, but on me. They were on my arms, my hands, crawling up my skin like living creatures, the same twisted symbols I had seen on the corpse. My breath caught in my throat as I watched them move, slithering across my flesh, burning as they went. I tried to brush them off, to scrub them away, but they were under my skin, a part of me now, and no amount of scrubbing would make them disappear. The pain was excruciating, a fire that seared my nerves, but it was the realization that terrified me most. These tattoos weren't just ink. They were a curse. I had to get out of there, had to find help, but the room had become a maze, every door I tried leading me back to the same place, the same twisted version of the morgue. The shadows seemed to follow me, creeping closer with every step, and the air was thick with the stench of sulfur and decay. My mind was unraveling, thoughts slipping through my fingers like sand, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The laughter hadn't returned, but I could feel its presence, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to strike. I wasn't sure how long I wandered through that nightmare, each turn bringing me back to the same room, the same empty table, the same feeling of being watched. The tattoos pulsed on my skin, their glow growing brighter, more intense, until it was blinding, searing into my eyes even when I closed them. I could hear whispers now, voices speaking in that same unknown language, the words wrapping around my mind like chains, dragging me down into madness. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows pressing against me, suffocating me, and I knew I couldn't hold on much longer. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the darkness began to close in, my vision narrowing until all I could see were those damned tattoos, burning into my skin, into my soul. The whispers grew louder, the words clearer, and I realized with a sickening dread that they were speaking directly to me, promising pain, torment, an eternity of suffering. I tried to fight it, tried to scream, but no sound came out, my voice swallowed by the void. The last thing I felt was the sensation of those tattoos crawling across my body, wrapping around me like a cocoon, before everything went black. And then there was nothing. No light, no sound, no pain, just an endless, all-consuming darkness. I floated in it, weightless, timeless, until I couldn't tell where I ended and the darkness began. But even in that void, I could still hear the faint echoes of laughter, still feel the burn of the tattoos on my skin. They had become a part of me, a curse that I couldn't escape, a mark that would follow me into whatever lay beyond. And as I drifted deeper into the abyss, I knew one thing for certain: whatever had been unleashed in that morgue, it wasn't finished with me. Not yet.